You're nothing but a worthless little girl who will never amount to anything." Those words, spoken by someone who was supposed to nurture my mind, echoed in my classroom like a death sentence for my dreams. That's how I learned that sometimes the people who hold the power to shape young minds use that power to break them instead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Good morning, my dear ones. I'm Sofia Sons, 79 years old, speaking to you from my cozy home in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where the cornfields stretch as far as the eye can see, and the seasons mark time like chapters in a long book. I'm here today to share a story I've carried in my heart for most of my life, a story about how one person's cruelty nearly destroyed my future, and how I fought my way back to prove them wrong. Before I begin this difficult journey back in time, I want you to know that this story, while painful, has a purpose. It's about the power of perseverance, the strength we don't know we have until we're forced to find it, and the beautiful truth that no one, absolutely no one, has the right to define your worth or determine your destiny. I was born in 1944 in the small farming community of Millfield, Nebraska, during a time when the world was at war and America was finding its strength. Our town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors helped neighbors during harvest time, and where a child's education was considered the golden ticket to a better life than their parents had known. My father, Robert Sons, worked the railroad that connected our little town to the bigger world beyond the wheat fields. He was a tall, sturdy man with calloused hands and gentle eyes, who believed that hard work and education were the twin pillars that could lift a family from poverty. Every morning before dawn, he'd put on his railroad overalls, kiss my mother goodbye, and head out to maintain the tracks that carried dreams and commerce across the heartland. My mother, Dorothy Sons, was a seamstress who took in work from the wealthier families in town. She had a gift for transforming simple fabric into beautiful dresses, and her delicate fingers could repair anything that was torn or broken. Our small house was always filled with the gentle hum of her sewing machine, a sound that became the soundtrack of my childhood. She would work late into the evening, her auburn hair pinned back, humming softly as she guided fabric through the machine. We lived in a modest white clapboard house on Elm Street, with a front porch that sagged slightly on one side and a vegetable garden in the back where my mother grew tomatoes, green beans, and the sweetest corn you ever tasted. It wasn't much by today's standards, but it was filled with love, laughter, and the constant encouragement to reach for something better. I was the youngest of 3 children. My older brother, William, was already 14 when I started school, working afternoons at Morrison's General Store to help the family finances. My sister, Patricia, was 12 and had inherited my mother's talent with needle and thread. She was quiet and careful, content to help with the sewing and household chores. But I was different from the start. Curious, talkative, always asking questions that made the adults smile and shake their heads. My parents recognized something in me early on. While my siblings were content with the familiar rhythms of small-town life, I was always reading, always wondering about the world beyond our cornfields. I devoured every book I could get my hands on, from the fairy tales in our small-town library to the old encyclopedias that Mr. Henderson, the banker, was throwing away. My father would find me reading under the covers with a flashlight long after bedtime, and instead of scolding me, he'd sit on the edge of my bed and ask me to tell him about the story. "Sophia," he'd say, smoothing my dark hair away from my face, "you've got a mind that's meant for big things. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." Those words became a precious gift I carried with me, though I didn't realize how much I would need them in the years to come. When I turned 6 in the spring of 1950, my parents were filled with excitement about my starting first grade that fall. Education was their greatest hope for me, the chance to go beyond the limitations that had defined their own lives. My father had left school after 8th grade to work, and my mother had never finished high school before marrying and starting a family. They saw in my love of learning the possibility of college, of a profession, of opportunities they could only dream about. That summer before 1st grade was magical. My mother spent weeks sewing my school clothes, simple but neat dresses in blue and green cotton, with crisp white collars that she'd carefully pressed each morning. She made me a small cloth bag to carry my pencils and the few precious books I owned. My father bought me my first real shoes. Not the hand-me-downs I'd been wearing, but brand new brown Oxfords that squeaked when I walked. "These are your learning shoes," he told me, with such pride in his voice. "They're going to take you places, Sophia girl." The night before my first day of school, our whole family sat around the dinner table talking about my future. William teased me about becoming too smart for the rest of them, but his eyes were kind. Patricia helped me practice writing my name in the careful script our mother had taught her. My parents spoke about their hopes. Maybe I could become a teacher myself someday, or work in an office in Lincoln or Omaha, or even go to the state university if I worked hard enough. I went to bed that night with my school clothes laid out carefully on the chair, my new shoes polished and waiting by the door, and my heart full of excitement about the adventure that awaited me. I had no idea that the person who would have the most influence over my young life would see my enthusiasm as something to be crushed, my potential as a threat to be eliminated, and my dreams as foolish fantasies that needed to be destroyed. Millfield Elementary School was a 2-story brick building that had served the community for over 30 years. It housed all grades from 1st through 8th, with 2 teachers handling the primary grades and 2 more managing the older children. The building smelled of chalk dust and floor wax, and the wooden floors creaked pleasantly under our feet as we walked the hallways lined with children's artwork and achievement charts. On that first morning in September 1950, my mother walked me to school, her hand warm and reassuring in mine. She had braided my long dark hair with extra care, tying it with a blue ribbon that matched my new dress. I carried my lunch in a small tin pail, a sandwich of bread my mother had baked herself, a hard-boiled egg, and an apple from our neighbor's tree. "Remember, sweetheart," my mother said as we approached the school steps, "be respectful, work hard, and show them how smart my little girl is." I promised I would, kissed her goodbye, and practically skipped up those steps, eager to begin this new chapter of my life. The other children seemed friendly enough, farm kids mostly, with sun-tanned faces and clothes that had been carefully mended and pressed for the special day. We were all nervous and excited, chattering about what we might learn and wondering what our teacher would be like. And then I met Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. She stood at the front of our classroom, like a general, surveying her troops. A tall, thin woman in her 40s, with steel-gray hair, pulled back in such a tight bun that it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. Her dress was dark navy blue, severe and unforgiving, and her shoes were sensible black leather that clicked ominously on the wooden floor when she walked. But it was her eyes that I remember most. Pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through you, as if she could see every flaw, every weakness, every reason why you weren't good enough. "Children," she announced in a voice as crisp and cold as a winter morning, "you will sit in alphabetical order. When I call your name, you will stand, say yes ma'am, and take your assigned seat. There will be no talking, no fidgeting, and absolutely no nonsense in my classroom." When she called Sofia Sons, I stood up eagerly, my voice bright with enthusiasm. "Yes, ma'am, but everyone calls me Sophie." The silence that followed was like ice forming on a pond. Mrs. Hartwell's pale eyes fixed on me with a coldness that made me step back involuntarily. Several of the other children shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something had gone wrong, though none of us could understand what. "Miss Sons," she said, each word carefully measured and sharp as broken glass, "in my classroom you will be called by your proper name, and you will learn that speaking out of turn is not tolerated. Take your seat and do not make another sound unless specifically asked to do so." I walked to my assigned desk on unsteady legs, my cheeks burning with embarrassment and confusion. What had I done wrong? At home, enthusiasm was celebrated, questions were encouraged, and my natural exuberance was seen as a sign of intelligence and curiosity. But here, in this classroom that was supposed to be the gateway to my bright future, I had somehow committed a grave offense simply by being myself. That first day set the tone for everything that followed. Mrs. Hartwell seemed to have identified me as a problem from the very beginning, though I couldn't understand why. While she spoke gently to some of the other children, praising them for simple tasks like sitting quietly or raising their hands properly, She watched me with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. When we practiced writing our letters, she would stand behind my desk, her shadow falling across my paper like a dark cloud. "Sloppy," she would murmur, just loud enough for me to hear. "Careless. You're not applying yourself, Sophia." But I was applying myself. I was trying harder than I'd ever tried anything in my short life. I wanted so desperately to please her, to show her that I was a good student, that I deserved to be there, that I could learn and grow and become the educated woman my parents dreamed I could be. The problem was, nothing I did seemed to be good enough for Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. And as the days turned into weeks, I began to realize that this wasn't about my performance at all. This was about something deeper, something darker, something that would challenge everything I believed about fairness, justice, and the power of education to lift us up rather than tear us down. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first sign that my educational journey would be unlike anything my parents had imagined came during our second week of school. We were learning about numbers, and Mrs. Hartwell had drawn simple addition problems on the blackboard. While most of my classmates struggled to understand that 2 apples plus 3 apples equals 5 apples, I found myself finishing the exercises quickly and looking around for something more challenging to do. At home, my father had already taught me basic arithmetic while helping him count railroad inventory, and my mother had shown me how to add up the costs of fabric and notions for her sewing projects. Numbers made sense to me in a way that seemed natural and effortless. So when Mrs. Hartwell asked if anyone could solve a slightly harder problem, 7 plus 6, I eagerly raised my hand. "Yes, Sophia," she said, and I noticed how she pronounced my name with a certain disdain, as if the very syllables offended her. 13, ma'am, I answered confidently. Instead of the praise I expected, the classroom fell silent. Mrs. Hartwell's pale eyes narrowed as she stared at me, her thin lips pressed into a line so tight they almost disappeared. "Stand up, Sophia," she commanded. I stood, confused but obedient, my heart beginning to race with an anxiety I couldn't name. The other children turned in their seats to look at me, their faces curious and concerned. "Class," Mrs. Hartwell announced, her voice carrying across the room like a judge pronouncing sentence. "Sophia thinks she's smarter than the rest of you. She thinks she doesn't need to wait her turn or follow the same rules as everyone else." My cheeks burned with shame and confusion. "But ma'am, You just what?" she interrupted, taking a step closer to my desk. "You just think you're special? You just think you're better than your classmates?" I wanted to explain that I wasn't trying to show off, that I was just excited about learning, that answering questions was what I thought school was for. But the words stuck in my throat like cotton balls, and I could only shake my head mutely. "Sit down and don't speak again unless I specifically call on you," she ordered. "And perhaps next time you'll remember that pride comes before a fall, young lady." I sank into my seat, my stomach churning with a mixture of embarrassment and bewilderment. Around me, my classmates had gone back to their work, but I could feel their sideways glances, and I sensed that something had shifted in the classroom dynamic. I had been marked as different, and not in a good way. That incident established a pattern that would define my entire first-grade experience. Every time I showed enthusiasm for learning, every time I demonstrated that I had grasped a concept quickly, every time I exhibited the curiosity and intelligence that my parents had always celebrated, Mrs. Hartwell found a way to turn it into a fault. When we began reading lessons and I read aloud with more fluency than most of my classmates, she accused me of showing off and made me sit in the corner with a dunce cap while the other children continued their lesson. When I finished a writing assignment early and asked if I could help other students who were struggling, she told me I was being presumptuous and assigned me extra work as punishment for not minding my own business. But perhaps most devastating of all were the subtle daily humiliations that chipped away at my confidence like water wearing down stone. Mrs. Hartwell had a talent for delivering cutting remarks in a tone so mild that any adult listening would think she was simply offering constructive guidance. "Sophia, dear," she would say while reviewing my carefully completed mathematics worksheet, "I can see you're trying very hard, but some children simply aren't equipped for academic work. There's no shame in being more suited for practical pursuits." Or, when I raised my hand to answer a question about a story we'd read, "Sophia, why don't you let one of the other children try? You've had quite enough attention for one day." The cruelest moments came during our weekly spelling tests. I had always been a natural speller, absorbing the patterns and rules of written language almost by instinct. Week after week, I would score perfectly on these tests, and week after week, Mrs. Hartwell would find a way to diminish my achievement. "Class," she announced one Friday afternoon after returning our corrected papers, "I want you to notice that while Sophia got all her words correct this week, her handwriting is still quite poor. Academic success means nothing if you can't present your work properly." She held up my paper for the entire class to see, pointing out every slightly slanted letter, every imperfectly formed curve. My cheeks burned as 20 pairs of eyes examined my work, looking for the flaws she had highlighted. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice taking on that particularly cold tone she used when she wanted to drive a point home, "I want you all to understand that memorizing spelling words is really quite a simple task. Any child can memorize if they spend enough time at it. True intelligence is shown through creative thinking and problem-solving, areas where some of us are more limited." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time, but I understood the tone, and I understood that somehow my success was being twisted into yet another reason why I wasn't good enough. The worst part was that I couldn't make sense of any of it. At home, my parents continued to encourage my love of learning. My father would quiz me on my arithmetic while we worked in the garden, beaming with pride when I could calculate how many rows of beans we could plant in a given space. My mother would listen with delight as I read aloud from the books I borrowed from the town library, praising my pronunciation and asking questions about the stories that showed she was genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions. "How was school today, sweetheart?" they would ask each evening at dinner, and I would struggle to find ways to answer that wouldn't worry them or make them think I was complaining. "Fine," I would say, picking at my food. "We learned about the letter M today." "Did you like the lesson?" my mother would ask, noticing my lack of enthusiasm. "Yes, ma'am," I would reply, because it was easier than trying to explain how Mrs. Hartwell had criticized the way I held my pencil, or how she had made me erase and rewrite the letter 15 times because my loops weren't consistent enough, or how she had told me that children from certain backgrounds often had trouble with fine motor skills. I was 7 years old, and I was learning to hide my pain, to swallow my confusion, to pretend that everything was normal when my world was being systematically dismantled by someone who was supposed to be helping me build it. The breaking point came in late October, during a lesson about community helpers. Mrs. Hartwell had asked each student to draw a picture of what they wanted to be when they grew up, and to write a sentence explaining their choice. I drew a picture of myself standing in front of a blackboard, teaching a classroom full of eager students. I had always loved the idea of being a teacher, someone who could share knowledge, inspire curiosity, and help children discover their potential. In my carefully practiced handwriting, I wrote, "I want to be a teacher because I love to learn and help others learn too." When Mrs. Hartwell collected our papers, she paused at my desk, studying my drawing with an expression I couldn't read. That afternoon, she kept me after class while the other children filed out for recess. "Sophia," she said, setting my paper on her desk where I could see it, "we need to have a conversation about realistic expectations." I stood in front of her desk, my hands clasped behind my back, waiting for whatever criticism would come next. "Teaching," she continued, her voice deceptively gentle, "is a profession that requires certain qualities. Intelligence, yes, but also leadership, respect from others, and the ability to command a classroom." She picked up my paper and studied it again, shaking her head slowly. "Some people are born to lead, Sophia, and others are born to follow. Some are meant for intellectual pursuits, and others are better suited for working with their hands. There's nothing wrong with knowing your place in the world." My 7-year-old mind struggled to process what she was telling me, but something deep in my chest began to ache. "You come from a working family," she continued, her words carefully measured. "Your father works on the railroad, your mother takes in sewing. These are honest, respectable occupations. But teaching requires a different sort of background, a different kind of preparation." She leaned forward, her pale eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me want to step backward. I think it would be much more realistic for you to consider following in your mother's footsteps. Sewing is a useful skill, and you could certainly make a living with your hands. But this idea of becoming a teacher..." She shook her head with what might have been pity. "Well, I'm afraid you're setting yourself up for disappointment." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs and leaving me dizzy with shock. All my life, my parents had told me I could be anything I wanted to be, that education was the key to unlimited possibilities. And here was my teacher, the person who was supposed to guide me toward that bright future, telling me that my dreams were unrealistic, that my background made me unfit for the very profession she herself held. "Do you understand what I'm telling you, Sofia?" she asked, her voice still maddeningly gentle. I nodded, though I didn't understand, not really. I understood that something precious was being taken away from me, something I hadn't even realized I could lose. I understood that the woman who was supposed to nurture my mind was instead systematically destroying my confidence in it. "Good," she said, crumpling up my drawing and tossing it into the wastebasket beside her desk. "Now run along to recess. And perhaps for next week's assignment, you can choose something more appropriate to your circumstances." I walked out of that classroom on unsteady legs, my chest tight with unshed tears, and my mind reeling with questions I didn't know how to ask. The October sun felt too bright. The laughter of children on the playground sounded too loud, and somewhere deep inside me, a light that had burned bright since birth began to flicker and dim. That night, for the first time since starting school, I lied to my parents about my day. When they asked about my lessons, I told them we had studied community helpers but didn't mention the assignment. When my father asked if I had learned anything interesting, I shrugged and said it was just regular school stuff. I couldn't bear to repeat Mrs. Hartwell's words, couldn't stand the thought of seeing my parents' faces if they knew that someone had told their daughter she wasn't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough to reach for her dreams. And so I began to carry the weight of her cruelty alone, a burden that would grow heavier with each passing day, each cutting remark, each systematic attempt to convince me that I was less than I had believed myself to be. November brought the first snow to Millfield, and with it, a change in me that my parents couldn't understand. The eager little girl who had skipped up the school steps just 2 months earlier now dragged her feet each morning, finding excuses to delay leaving the house. I developed mysterious stomachaches that appeared every weekday morning and vanished by evening. I stopped talking about my lessons at dinner, stopped asking for help with my homework, and stopped reading the library books that had once been my greatest joy. "Sofia seems quieter lately," I overheard my mother telling my father one evening as they sat by the kitchen window, watching the snowfall. "Do you think she's having trouble adjusting to school?" My father's voice was thoughtful as he replied, "Maybe she's just getting used to the routine. Remember how Patricia was shy when she started? Some children take longer to find their confidence. If only they had known that my confidence wasn't missing. It was being systematically destroyed, piece by piece, day after day." Mrs. Hartwell had perfected her campaign against me with the precision of a military strategist. She had learned exactly which words would cut the deepest, which criticisms would linger in my mind long after the school day ended, and which methods would isolate me from my classmates without leaving any obvious evidence of her cruelty. One of her favorite tactics was what she called constructive comparisons. During our daily reading circle, she would have each student read a paragraph aloud, offering comments on their performance. When it was my turn, even though I read clearly and with expression, she would use my reading as a launching point for lessons about humility. "Very good, Sofia," she would say in that deceptively sweet tone. "You read those words quite well. Of course, reading aloud is really just a matter of memorization and practice. True comprehension, understanding the deeper meaning of what we read, requires a different kind of intelligence entirely." Then she would turn to another student, often Bobby Mitchell, whose father owned the largest farm in the county. "Bobby, would you like to tell us what you think the author was really trying to say in this passage?" It didn't matter that Bobby could barely sound out individual words, much less grasp abstract concepts. Mrs. Hartwell would nod approvingly at whatever simple response he gave, praising his thoughtful analysis and his natural insight. "You see, class," she would conclude, "this is the difference between mere technical skill and genuine understanding. Some children can perform the mechanics of reading quite adequately, but it takes a special kind of mind to truly comprehend literature. The message was always the same. I might be able to do the work, but I lacked the inherent intelligence that mattered. I was a performing monkey, capable of tricks but incapable of real thought. Lacka. These lessons in my supposed inadequacy extended to every subject. In arithmetic, when I solved problems correctly, she would dismiss my answers as rote memorization and praise other students for their mathematical reasoning, even when their answers were wrong. During science lessons about the seasons or the solar system, she would cut me off mid-sentence when I tried to contribute, saying that I was monopolizing the discussion and needed to give others a chance to think. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of her treatment was how she manipulated my relationships with my classmates. Children of that age are naturally attuned to the social dynamics of their classroom, and they quickly learned that associating with me brought unwanted attention from Mrs. Hartwell. I remember one particularly painful incident in December, just before our Christmas break. Jenny Morrison, the daughter of the general store owner and one of the few children who had shown any interest in being my friend, had asked if I wanted to sit with her during lunch. We were giggling together over our sandwiches, sharing stories about our family's holiday preparations, when Mrs. Hartwell appeared at our table. "Jenny, dear," she said, placing a gentle hand on Jenny's shoulder, "I wonder if you might come help me organize the Christmas decorations. I could use someone with your artistic eye." Jenny beamed at the praise and immediately stood up, leaving me alone at the table. But before she walked away, Mrs. Hartwell added, "And Jenny, perhaps tomorrow you might consider sitting with some of the other children. It's important to include everyone, don't you think? We wouldn't want anyone to feel left out." The message was clear. Sitting with me meant excluding others. Being my friend meant being selfish. From that day forward, Jenny offered polite smiles when we passed in the hallway, but she never sat with me again. One by one, my potential friendships withered under Mrs. Hartwell's subtle interference. She had a gift for making her manipulations seem like acts of kindness. She was just helping children be more inclusive, more thoughtful, more aware of others' feelings. But the result was my complete social isolation within the classroom. During recess, I would stand alone by the fence, watching the other children play games I was never invited to join. At lunch, I sat by myself, eating the carefully prepared meals my mother packed while listening to the chatter and laughter from other tables. During group activities, I was always the last one chosen, if I was chosen at all, and my contributions to group projects were consistently overlooked or dismissed. The isolation was perhaps more painful than the direct criticism, because it convinced me that Mrs. Hartwell must be right about me. If I were truly as smart and special as my parents believed, wouldn't the other children want to be around me? If I were genuinely kind and interesting, wouldn't I have friends? The evidence seemed to support her assessment. I was different, and not in a good way. At home, my behavior became increasingly withdrawn. I stopped volunteering to help with household chores, activities that had once given me pride and a sense of contribution. When my siblings tried to include me in their conversations, I would mumble responses and find excuses to leave the room. The library books that had once transported me to magical worlds now sat unread on my bedside table. My parents, growing more concerned by the day, tried various approaches to draw me out of my shell. My father would invite me to help with his weekend projects, hoping that working together might encourage me to talk about whatever was troubling me. My mother would suggest special mother-daughter activities, baking cookies together, working on a sewing project, taking walks through town, anything that might recreate the closeness we had once shared. "Sophia, sweetheart," my mother said one Saturday afternoon as we sat at the kitchen table, ostensibly working on a simple embroidery project she had designed to cheer me up. "You know you can talk to me about anything, don't you? If something is wrong at school, or if someone is bothering you." I looked up from the fabric in my hands, seeing the worry lines around her eyes, the way her mouth turned down at the corners when she thought I wasn't looking. How could I tell her that her dreams for my education were crumbling? How could I explain that the teacher she respected and trusted was slowly convincing me that I was everything she had raised me not to believe about myself? "Nothing's wrong, Mama," I lied, focusing intently on my stitches. "School is fine. I'm just tired, I guess." She reached across the table and touched my hand gently. "You know, when I was your age, I sometimes felt overwhelmed by all the new things I was learning. It's normal to feel a little confused or discouraged sometimes. If only confusion and discouragement were all I was feeling. What I was experiencing was something much darker, a growing certainty that I was fundamentally flawed, that my parents' faith in me was misplaced, that Mrs. Hartwell's cold assessment of my limitations was simply the truth I had been too naive to see. The breaking point came just before Christmas vacation, during our final week of school before the holiday break. Mrs. Hartwell had announced that we would be presenting special projects about family traditions to the class, and each student would have 5 minutes to share something meaningful about how their family celebrated the season. I had been excited about this assignment. Finally, something that played to my strengths. I loved stories. I loved my family's traditions. And I had carefully prepared a presentation about how my mother and I made special Christmas cookies using a recipe that had been passed down from my grandmother. I had practiced my presentation at home, timing it carefully and organizing my thoughts so that I could share not just the recipe, but also the stories my mother had told me about baking with her own mother during the Great Depression, when ingredients were scarce and families had to be creative to make the holidays special. When my turn came, I stood in front of the class with more confidence than I had felt in months. This was my chance to show that I could contribute something valuable, something that came from my heart, rather than just my ability to memorize facts or solve problems. I began telling the story of my great-grandmother's resourcefulness, how she had learned to substitute honey for sugar and use applesauce in place of butter when money was tight. I described the way my mother's face lit up when she told these stories, and how our kitchen filled with warmth and laughter when we baked together. I was just getting to the part about how the cookies had become a symbol of our family's resilience when Mrs. Hartwell interrupted me. "Thank you, Sophia," she said, her voice cutting through my words like a knife through silk. "I think we've heard quite enough about resourcefulness born of necessity." The way she said those last words made them sound shameful, as if poverty and the creative solutions it required were something to be embarrassed about rather than proud of. "Let's move on to someone who might have a more traditional Christmas story to share," she continued, already turning her attention to the next student. I stood there for a moment, my carefully prepared words dying in my throat, my face burning with humiliation. Around me, my classmates avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the tension but unwilling to challenge the teacher's authority. As I returned to my seat, I heard Mrs. Hartwell say quietly, but just loud enough for me to hear, "Some families have different standards for what constitutes a meaningful tradition." That night, I cried myself to sleep for the first time since starting school. Not because of any single cruel word or unfair criticism, but because I finally understood what Mrs. Hartwell was teaching me. That my family's love, my parents' dreams, and my own aspirations were all built on a foundation of delusion. I wasn't special. I wasn't destined for great things. I was just a little girl from a working-class family who had gotten ideas above her station. And maybe, I thought as I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, maybe it was time I learned to accept that truth. January 1951 arrived with a blizzard that buried Millfield under 3 feet of snow, delaying the start of the new semester by a full week. I spent those extra days at home in a strange state of dread, knowing that each passing hour brought me closer to returning to Mrs. Hartwell's classroom. The Christmas break had been a brief respite, a time when I could almost remember what it felt like to be the confident, curious child I had been just a few months earlier. During those holiday weeks, surrounded by my family's love and encouragement, I had begun to hope that maybe the new year would bring a fresh start. Maybe Mrs. Hartwell would see that I had matured over the break. Maybe she would give me another chance to prove that I belonged in her classroom, that I could be the kind of student she respected. How naive I was to think that a woman who had spent months systematically destroying a 7-year-old's self-worth would suddenly develop compassion. When school finally resumed, I discovered that my ordeal was far from over. In fact, Mrs. Hartwell seemed to have used the break to devise new and more devastating ways to remind me of my supposed inadequacy. The first blow came during our very first lesson back. She had rearranged the classroom over the holiday, and when I arrived that Monday morning, I found that my desk had been moved to the very back corner of the room, separated from the other students by several feet of empty space. When I hesitated, looking around for clarification, she addressed me without looking up from her lesson plan. Sophia, you'll find your new seat in the back. I've decided that some students learn better with fewer distractions. The message was unmistakable. I was a distraction. My presence disrupted the learning environment for the other children. I was being quarantined like a disease. From my isolated position in the corner, I could barely see the blackboard, and Mrs. Hartwell's voice seemed to come from a great distance. When she asked questions of the class, she would scan the room with her eyes, looking at every student except me. When she handed out materials for activities, mine were always delivered last, dropped on my desk without comment or eye contact. But it was during our first writing assignment of the new semester that Mrs. Hartwell revealed the true depths of her cruelty. She asked us to write a paragraph about our goals for the new year, encouraging us to think about what we wanted to learn or accomplish in the coming months. Despite everything I had endured, a small flame of hope still flickered within me. I wrote carefully about wanting to improve my handwriting, to learn about faraway places through our geography lessons, and to become a better reader. I avoided mentioning my dream of becoming a teacher that had been thoroughly crushed, but I couldn't help expressing my genuine love of learning. When Mrs. Hartwell collected our papers, she paused at my desk longer than at the others, reading my work with an expression that grew increasingly stern. That afternoon, she announced that she would be reading some of the assignments aloud to demonstrate different approaches to the task. She began with Bobby Mitchell's paper, praising his realistic goals of learning to multiply and helping his father with farm work. She read Jenny Morrison's essay about wanting to be a better friend and sister, commenting on the maturity and thoughtfulness of her objectives. Then she picked up my paper. "Class?" she said, her voice taking on that particular tone that always preceded my humiliation. "I want to share with you an example of goals that are, perhaps, too ambitious for some students." She began reading my words aloud, but her tone transformed my earnest hopes into something that sounded foolish and pretentious. When she reached the part about wanting to learn about faraway places, she paused dramatically. "You see, children, some students set goals that are far beyond their actual capabilities. While it's admirable to want to improve, we must be realistic about our limitations." She set my paper down and looked directly at me, her pale eyes cold and merciless. "Sophia, would you please stand up and tell the class why you think you need to learn about faraway places? What possible use could such knowledge be to someone in your circumstances?" I stood on trembling legs, my face burning with shame. 20 pairs of eyes turned to look at me, some curious, some pitying, all uncomfortable with the tension that had become a regular feature of our classroom. I just think it would be interesting," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Interesting," she repeated, as if the word itself was ridiculous. "Class, Sophia finds geography interesting. But let me ask you this. When Sophia grows up to work in a factory, or as a seamstress like her mother, will knowing about faraway places help her sew a straighter seam? Will it help her operate machinery more efficiently?" The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "This is why we must be practical in our education," she continued, still looking at me as if I were a specimen in a jar. "Some children are meant for intellectual pursuits, and others are meant for manual labor. There's nothing wrong with manual labor. It's honest work. But we do these children no favors by filling their heads with unrealistic expectations." She finally allowed me to sit down, but the damage was done. She had not only humiliated me in front of my classmates, but had also publicly declared that my dreams were inappropriate for someone of my social class. I was being taught to know my place, to accept limitations based not on my abilities but on my family's economic status. The weeks that followed brought an escalating campaign of systematic degradation. Mrs. Hartwell began assigning me different work than the other students. Simpler tasks that she claimed were more appropriate to my skill level. While my classmates worked on reading comprehension exercises, I was given basic phonics worksheets designed for children much younger than myself. When they practiced writing paragraphs, I was assigned to copy simple sentences. "I'm helping you build a foundation," she would say when I looked confused about the disparity. "Some children need more time with the basics before they can move on to advanced work." But I could see through her justification. She wasn't helping me build a foundation, she was digging me a grave. Every day, the gap between my assignments and those of my peers grew wider, making it appear as though I truly was intellectually inferior to my classmates. The psychological impact was devastating. I began to doubt not just my academic abilities but my fundamental worth as a human being. If someone as educated and respected as Mrs. Hartwell believed I was inferior, if she thought my dreams were laughably unrealistic, then surely it must be true. I stopped reading at home entirely, telling my parents that I was too tired or had too much homework. The truth was that I couldn't bear to enjoy books anymore, couldn't allow myself the pleasure of learning, because Mrs. Hartwell had convinced me that such enjoyment was inappropriate for someone like me. My grades, predictably, began to suffer. Not because I couldn't do the work, but because I had lost all motivation to try. What was the point of excelling if excellence would only be dismissed or explained away? What was the point of learning if knowledge was considered above my station? The final devastating blow came in early March, during a parent-teacher conference that I didn't know was taking place until it was over. My parents had requested the meeting, worried about my declining performance and my obvious unhappiness. They arrived at the school that evening with hope in their hearts, ready to work with my teacher to help their daughter succeed. I learned about the meeting the next morning when my mother woke me for school with tears in her eyes. She and my father were sitting at the kitchen table, their faces grave and troubled. "Sophia, sweetheart," my mother began, her voice carefully controlled. "We spoke with Mrs. Hartwell last night about your schoolwork." My stomach dropped. Whatever had been said, it wasn't good. "She's concerned about you," my father added, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by Mrs. Hartwell's concern. "She thinks you might be struggling more than we realized." My mother reached across the table and took my hand. "She says you're having trouble keeping up with the other children, that you seem distracted and unfocused in class." These were lies, and part of me wanted to scream the truth, that I wasn't unfocused, I was being systematically ignored and excluded. That I wasn't struggling with the work, I was being given work designed for much younger children. That my problems weren't academic but psychological, the result of months of emotional abuse. But how could a 7-year-old articulate such complex truths? How could I explain to my loving parents that their faith in education, their trust in the system they believed would lift me up, was misplaced? "She also said," my father continued, his voice growing quieter, "that she thinks you might be happier in a different kind of educational environment. Something more practical, more suited to your learning style." The euphemisms were cruel in their kindness. Mrs. Hartwell had convinced my parents that I was intellectually limited, that their dreams for my education were not just unrealistic but potentially harmful to my emotional well-being. "We want what's best for you, sweetheart," my mother said, squeezing my hand. "If you're not happy in school, if you're having trouble learning." I looked at my parents, these good, honest people who had worked so hard to give me opportunities they never had, and saw their dreams for me dying in real time. I saw their confusion, their disappointment, their growing acceptance that perhaps their daughter wasn't as special as they had believed. And in that moment, something inside me broke completely. If my own parents were beginning to doubt my abilities, if even they were starting to believe Mrs. Hartwell's assessment of my limitations, then it must be true. I was nothing special. I was never going to be anything more than what Mrs. Hartwell said I was destined to be. And maybe it was time I stopped fighting that truth. "I understand," I whispered, my voice hollow and defeated. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I'm just not smart enough for regular school." The words tasted like ashes in my mouth, but they also brought a strange kind of relief. There was a terrible peace and surrender, in finally accepting what everyone seemed to believe about me. I didn't know it then, but that moment of surrender would be the beginning of the darkest period of my young life, and also, eventually, the first step toward finding my way back to the light. 3 weeks after the devastating parent-teacher conference, something extraordinary happened that would change the trajectory of my life forever. But like many miracles, it came disguised as an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in March 1951. I was sitting at my isolated desk in the back corner, mechanically copying sentences from a first-grade workbook, while my classmates worked on a creative writing assignment about spring flowers. The disparity in our tasks had become so routine that I barely noticed it anymore. I had learned to disappear into myself during school hours, to become as small and invisible as possible, hoping to avoid Mrs. Hartwell's attention entirely. The classroom door opened, and Principal Edwards entered with a woman I had never seen before. She was younger than Mrs. Hartwell, perhaps in her early 30s, with kind brown eyes and auburn hair pinned back in a practical style. She wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with a quiet confidence that immediately caught my attention. "Mrs. Hartwell," Principal Edwards said, "I'd like to introduce Miss Catherine Riley. She's the new district supervisor for primary education, here to observe teaching methods and student progress." Mrs. Hartwell's face went through a series of micro-expressions that I had become expert at reading. Surprise, then concern, then that practiced smile she used when other adults were watching. "Of course," Mrs. Hartwell replied smoothly. "We're delighted to have you observe our classroom. As you can see, we're working on our writing skills today." Miss Riley nodded politely and moved to the back of the classroom, taking a seat at the small desk usually reserved for parent volunteers. From my corner position, I was closer to her than any other student, though I kept my eyes fixed on my copying exercise, not wanting to draw attention to myself. For the next hour, Miss Riley observed silently, taking occasional notes in a small leather journal. I was acutely aware of her presence, partly because visitors to our classroom were rare, but mostly because something about her demeanor suggested she was actually seeing what was happening around her, not just going through the motions of an official visit. When Mrs. Hartwell called on students to share their creative writing, Miss Riley leaned forward slightly, clearly paying attention to both the content of their work and Mrs. Hartwell's responses. I noticed her eyebrows raised slightly when Jenny Morrison shared a simple but sweet poem about daffodils and received effusive praise, while Tommy Patterson's equally simple verse about baseball was hailed as, quote, showing real creativity and original thinking. Then something unexpected happened. Miss Riley stood up and walked quietly around the classroom, glancing at students' work as they continued writing. When she reached my corner, she paused, looking down at my workbook with obvious confusion. "Excuse me," she said softly, so only I could hear. "May I see what you're working on?" My heart hammered as I tilted the workbook toward her. She studied the simple sentences I had been copying. "The cat is black. The dog runs fast. The bird sings pretty songs." Minus, and then looked at the creative writing assignment posted on the blackboard. Her eyes moved from the board to my workbook and back again, and I could see her trying to understand why I was doing completely different work from the rest of the class. "Sophia," she whispered, reading my name from the label on my desk. "Why aren't you writing about spring flowers like the other children?" The question was asked with such genuine curiosity and kindness that for a moment I forgot to be afraid. "Mrs. Hartwell says I need to practice my basics first," I whispered back, repeating the explanation I had heard so many times. Miss Riley's expression grew thoughtful. "I see. And how long have you been practicing these particular basics?" "Since January," I admitted, my voice barely audible. Something shifted in Miss Riley's face, a subtle tightening around her eyes that suggested she was beginning to understand that all was not as it should be in Mrs. Hartwell's classroom. "Would you like to write about spring flowers?" she asked quietly. The question hit me like a physical blow. Want? I had trained myself not to want anything beyond what I was given, not to hope for anything beyond what Mrs. Hartwell deemed appropriate for someone like me. But Miss Riley's gentle question awakened something that had been dormant for months. "Yes, ma'am," I whispered, the admission feeling like a dangerous confession. Miss Riley smiled, the first genuine smile an adult had directed at me in months. "Well then, perhaps you could show me what you might write if you were given the chance." She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from her bag and placed it on my desk beside the workbook. "Just a few sentences," she encouraged. "Whatever comes to mind when you think about spring." I stared at the blank paper, my mind racing. This felt like a test, but not the kind Mrs. Hartwell administered. This felt like someone was actually interested in what I might have to say, in what thoughts lived inside my head. With trembling hands, I picked up my pencil and began to write. Spring is like a promise that winter always keeps. The flowers push through the cold ground to show us that beautiful things can come from dark places. When I see the first daffodil, I remember that even when everything seems dead, there is still life waiting underneath. As I wrote, I felt something stirring inside me that I had almost forgotten existed, the joy of expressing my own thoughts, of finding words to capture the images and feelings in my mind. The sentences flowed more easily than any writing I had done in months, and for a few precious minutes, I forgot where I was and simply lost myself in the pleasure of creation. When I finished, Miss Riley read my words carefully, her expression growing more serious with each line. She looked at me with new eyes, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "Sophia," she said quietly, "this is beautiful writing. Very mature and thoughtful." Before I could respond, Mrs. Hartwell's voice cut across the classroom. "Miss Riley, I hope Sophia isn't disturbing your observation. As I mentioned, she requires quite a bit of individual attention." Miss Riley stood and walked to the front of the classroom, carrying my paper with her. "Actually, Mrs. Hartwell, I was hoping you could help me understand Sophia's curriculum. She seems to be working on significantly different material from her classmates." Mrs. Hartwell's smile became strained. "Yes, well, Sophia has some learning difficulties that require a more modified approach. We've found that she becomes overwhelmed when given work that's too advanced for her capabilities." "I see," Miss Riley said neutrally. "And how long has she been on this modified curriculum?" "Since the beginning of the semester. Her parents and I agreed that it would be best for her emotional well-being." Miss Riley nodded thoughtfully, then held up my paper. "And yet, when I asked her to write about spring flowers, the same assignment as her classmates, she produced this." She began reading my words aloud to the entire class. As my sentences filled the classroom, I saw my classmates' faces change from their usual polite disinterest to genuine surprise. These were ideas and images that resonated with them, expressed in language that was clearly beyond what they expected from the girl who had been relegated to copying simple sentences for months. When Miss Riley finished reading, the classroom was silent. Mrs. Hartwell's face had gone pale, and I could see her struggling to formulate a response that would explain away this evidence of my actual capabilities. "Well," Mrs. Hartwell said finally, her voice tight, "I suppose Sophia can occasionally rise to the occasion when given extra encouragement. But as I'm sure you understand, we can't base our entire curriculum on occasional flashes of effort." Miss Riley's expression remained carefully neutral, but I could sense that she was far from satisfied with this explanation. "Of course. I wonder if I might speak with Sophia privately for a few minutes, just to get a better sense of her individual needs." It wasn't really a request, despite her polite phrasing. Mrs. Hartwell had no choice but to agree. Miss Riley led me out into the hallway, away from the curious ears of my classmates and the hostile presence of my teacher. For the first time in months, I found myself alone with an adult who seemed to see me as something other than a problem to be managed or a disappointment to be contained. "Sophia," she said, kneeling down so we were at eye level, "I want you to tell me the truth about what's been happening in your classroom. Can you do that for me?" Something in her tone, the genuine concern, the respect, the assumption that I was capable of truthful communication, broke through the walls I had built around my heart. Suddenly, months of stored pain and confusion came pouring out in a torrent of words. I told her about the constant criticism disguised as guidance, about being moved to the back corner like I was contagious, about the different assignments that made me appear stupid to my classmates. I told her about the humiliation of having my dreams dismissed as unrealistic, about the parent-teacher conference that had convinced even my own parents that I was limited. Most importantly, I told her about how I used to love learning, how I used to believe I was smart and capable, and how Mrs. Hartwell had systematically convinced me that those beliefs were delusions. Miss Riley listened without interruption, her face growing more troubled with each revelation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her brown eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in an adult's face for months: outrage on my behalf. "Sophia," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. Nothing that has happened to you in that classroom is your fault. Nothing you've been told about your limitations is true. You are a bright, creative, capable little girl, and what's been done to you is not just wrong, it's cruel." Her words hit me like sunlight after months of darkness. For the first time since September, an adult was telling me that my perceptions were valid, that my pain was real, that I was not the problem. "What's going to happen now?" I asked, afraid to hope but unable to stop myself. Miss Riley stood, her expression determined. "Now, young lady, Things are going to change, I promise you that. As we walked back toward the classroom, I felt something stirring inside me that I had thought was gone forever. It was small and fragile, like a tiny green shoot pushing through concrete, but it was unmistakably real. It was hope. The change didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it was swift and decisive. Miss Riley spent the remainder of that Tuesday afternoon in our classroom, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions that made Mrs. Hartwell increasingly uncomfortable. I watched from my corner desk as my teacher's composure began to crack under the scrutiny of someone who clearly understood far more about education than she had anticipated. That evening, Miss Riley requested another meeting with my parents, but this time without Mrs. Hartwell present. I wasn't supposed to know about it, but I overheard my mother on the telephone with Mrs. Henderson from next door, her voice filled with confusion and worry. "She says she needs to discuss Sophia's educational needs," my mother was saying. "But we just had a conference with Mrs. Hartwell 3 weeks ago. I don't understand what could have changed." What had changed, though I didn't fully understand it at the time, was that someone with real authority had finally witnessed what had been happening to me. Miss Riley had seen through Mrs. Hartwell's carefully constructed facade and recognized the systematic abuse for what it was. The meeting took place the following evening in Principal Edwards' office. My parents returned home afterward with expressions I had never seen before, a mixture of relief, anger, and something that looked like grief. They sat me down at the kitchen table, and for the first time in months, I saw hope returning to their eyes. "Sophia, sweetheart," my father began, his voice thick with emotion. "Miss Riley told us some things about what's been happening at school, things we should have known about, should have seen." My mother reached across the table and took my hands in hers. "She showed us your writing, honey, the piece you wrote about spring. It was beautiful, Sophia, so much more advanced than anything Mrs. Hartwell led us to believe you could do." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, not tears of shame or fear, but tears of relief so profound it made my chest ache. Miss Riley explained that Mrs. Hartwell has been— My father paused, searching for words. "Has been giving you work that was far below your ability level. That she's been telling you things about yourself that simply aren't true." "Why?" I asked, my voice small. "Why would she do that to me?" My parents exchanged a look that spoke of adult understanding of complexities I was too young to grasp. Years later, I would understand that Mrs. Hartwell's cruelty likely stemmed from her own prejudices about social class, her belief that children from working families shouldn't aspire beyond their station. But at 7 years old, all I needed to know was that it wasn't my fault. "Some people," my mother said carefully, "sometimes let their own problems make them forget how to be kind. But that's never, ever, an excuse for hurting a child." "What happens now?" I asked, the question that had been burning inside me since Miss Riley's visit. "Now," my father said, his voice firm with newfound determination, "things are going to be different. Miss Riley is arranging for you to be tested by someone who specializes in understanding how children learn. And Mrs. Hartwell," he paused, his jaw tightening. "Mrs. Hartwell is going to face some very serious questions about her teaching methods." The testing Miss Riley arranged was unlike anything I had experienced in Mrs. Hartwell's classroom. It took place over 2 afternoons in a sunny room at the district office, conducted by a gentle woman named Dr. Margaret Stone, who seemed genuinely interested in discovering what I could do rather than what I couldn't. Dr. Stone gave me puzzles to solve, stories to read and discuss, mathematical problems to work through, and creative writing exercises that actually challenged my abilities. For the first time in months, I felt my mind stretching and reaching, grappling with ideas that excited rather than defeated me. "Sophia," Dr. Stone said during our second session, as I finished explaining my solution to a particularly complex logic puzzle, "has anyone ever told you that you're quite gifted?" The word hit me like lightning. Gifted. Not limited, not struggling, not inappropriate for my circumstances. Gifted? "Mrs. Hartwell says I'm slow," I whispered, still afraid to contradict an adult's assessment. Dr. Stone's expression grew sad and stern at the same time. "Mrs. Hartwell is wrong, Sophia. Very, very wrong. You're actually performing at a level I'd expect from children 2 or 3 years older than you. Your reading comprehension is remarkable, your mathematical reasoning is sophisticated, and your writing shows creativity and emotional depth, That's quite unusual for someone your age." She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "What happened to you in that classroom was not about your abilities, Sophia. It was about an adult who failed in her most fundamental responsibility, to nurture and encourage a child's growth." The results of Dr. Stone's evaluation sent shockwaves through Millfield Elementary. My test scores placed me in the top 5% of children my age in every academic area. The gulf between my actual abilities and Mrs. Hartwell's assessment of me was so vast that it could only be explained by deliberate misrepresentation. Within a week of receiving Dr. Stone's report, Principal Edwards called Mrs. Hartwell into his office for what would be her final conference as a teacher at Millfield Elementary. I learned years later that Miss Riley had also discovered evidence of similar treatment of other students from working-class families, a pattern of low expectations and subtle sabotage that had gone undetected for years. Mrs. Hartwell submitted her resignation before the school board could take formal action against her. She left Millfield quietly at the end of the school year, and I never saw her again. But the damage she had done couldn't be erased simply by her departure. The remaining weeks of first grade were taught by a substitute teacher, Mrs. Young, who was everything Mrs. Hartwell had not been: encouraging, fair, and genuinely excited about children's learning. Under her guidance, I began to rediscover my love of school, though the confidence Mrs. Hartwell had systematically destroyed would take much longer to rebuild. Mrs. Young immediately moved me back to the front of the classroom and gave me the same assignments as my classmates. More than that, she recognized that I needed work that would actually challenge me. She began giving me additional reading materials, more complex writing assignments, and mathematical problems that required real thinking rather than simple memorization. "Sophia," she said one afternoon as she handed me a book of poetry to take home, "I want you to remember something very important. You have a beautiful mind, and it's my job to help you use it, not to make you hide it." My classmates, who had grown accustomed to seeing me as the struggling student in the corner, were initially confused by my sudden transformation. But children are remarkably adaptable, and it didn't take long for them to accept that I had always been capable. They had simply been led to believe otherwise. Jenny Morrison was the first to approach me during recess after my return to the regular curriculum. "Sophia," she said hesitantly, "I always wondered why you seemed so sad this year. You were different from when we first started school." Mrs. Hartwell made me think I was stupid, I admitted, the words still difficult to say aloud. Jenny's eyes widened. "But you're not stupid at all. That story you wrote about spring was better than anything I could write." It was a simple statement from a 7-year-old classmate, but it meant more to me than any adult praise could have. My peers could see what Mrs. Hartwell had tried so hard to hide, that I belonged among them, that I was capable, that I had value. The summer between first and second grade was a time of healing and rediscovery. My parents, armed with new understanding of my actual abilities, encouraged me to read voraciously. They checked out stacks of books from the library, bought me composition notebooks to fill with stories and poems, and listened with genuine interest as I shared what I was learning. "We're so sorry, Sophia," my mother said one evening as we sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "We should have known something was wrong. We should have listened more carefully when you stopped wanting to talk about school." "You trusted my teacher," I replied, my 7-year-old wisdom already understanding that adults sometimes make mistakes with the best of intentions. "You thought she was helping me." My father, who had been quiet during this conversation, finally spoke. "Sophia, I want you to promise me something. If anyone, teacher, authority figure, anyone, ever tries to make you feel small again, you tell us immediately. And you remember what Miss Riley and Dr. Stone discovered about you. You're not just smart, you're exceptional. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." As summer turned toward fall and the prospect of second grade approached, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I was eager to learn again, to be challenged and encouraged, but I also carried scars that wouldn't heal quickly. I had learned too young that adults could be cruel, that authority figures weren't always trustworthy, and that the world could be unfair in ways that children shouldn't have to understand. But I had also learned something equally important, that truth has a way of emerging, that there are good people willing to fight for what's right, and that even when we've been broken, we can heal and grow stronger. The little girl who walked into Mrs. Peterson's second-grade classroom that September was different from the one who had eagerly skipped up the school steps a year earlier. I was more cautious, more aware of the potential for cruelty, more protective of my inner life. But I was also more resilient, more determined, and more certain of my own worth. Mrs. Hartwell had tried to convince me that I was destined for limitation, that my dreams were inappropriate for someone of my background. Instead, she had inadvertently taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my life, that other people's opinions of us, no matter how authoritatively they're presented, don't define our reality. My worth wasn't determined by Mrs. Hartwell's assessment any more than my future was limited by her narrow vision of what was possible. As I took my seat in Mrs. Peterson's classroom, surrounded by books and bright bulletin boards celebrating student achievement, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year, the pure joy of being exactly where I belonged. Second grade with Mrs. Peterson marked the beginning of what I can only describe as my renaissance. For the first time in my academic life, I had a teacher who not only recognized my abilities but actively sought to nurture and expand them. Mrs. Peterson was a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked brown hair and laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of decades spent genuinely enjoying children's company. On the first day of school, she did something that seemed small but meant everything to me. She asked each student to share not just their name, but something they were excited to learn about that year. When my turn came, I hesitated. The previous year had taught me to be cautious about expressing enthusiasm, to hide my curiosity rather than celebrate it. But something in Mrs. Peterson's warm brown eyes encouraged me to take a risk. "I'm Sofia Sons," I said, my voice gaining strength as I spoke, "and I want to learn about everything. I want to read books about faraway places, and learn how numbers work together, and maybe write stories that make people feel happy." Instead of the dismissive response I had learned to expect, Mrs. Peterson's face lit up with genuine delight. "Sophia, what a wonderful attitude! Learning about everything is exactly what second grade is for. I can already tell we're going to have a fantastic year together." That simple exchange set the tone for everything that followed. Mrs. Peterson didn't just teach, she ignited curiosity. She didn't just assign work, she created adventures. Under her guidance, mathematics became a series of fascinating puzzles to solve, reading became a passport to infinite worlds, and writing became a way to capture and share the magic I saw in everyday life. More importantly, Mrs. Peterson seemed to understand intuitively that I needed more than just academic challenge. I needed healing. She never asked directly about my previous year's experience, but I could sense that she knew I had been wounded and was deliberately creating an environment where I could begin to trust again. When I excelled on assignments, she celebrated my success without making it seem like an exception. When I struggled with something new, she offered support without making me feel inadequate. Most crucially, she treated my curiosity and enthusiasm as gifts, rather than problems to be managed. By October, I was reading at a fourth grade level and completing mathematical problems that challenged students 2 years older than me. But Mrs. Peterson was careful not to isolate me from my peers as Mrs. Hartwell had done. Instead, she found ways to use my abilities to benefit the entire class. "Sophia," she said one afternoon as we prepared for our unit on American history, "I noticed you've been reading some books about the Revolutionary War from the library. Would you like to help me create some special activities for our class? I think your research could help make our lessons even more interesting." This was a revelation. My knowledge and enthusiasm could be an asset to my classmates rather than a source of division. Working with Mrs. Peterson, I helped design quiz games, suggested additional reading materials, and even wrote short dramatic scenes that we performed to bring historical events to life. My classmates, instead of being resentful of my contributions, were genuinely appreciative. Jenny Morrison, who had become my closest friend again, often sought my help with her own projects, and I discovered the joy of teaching others, of sharing knowledge in a way that lifted everyone up rather than making anyone feel small. The transformation wasn't just academic, it was deeply personal. The confident, curious child who had been buried under months of systematic degradation began to emerge once again. I started raising my hand eagerly in class, volunteering for special projects, and even approaching Mrs. Peterson with my own ideas for learning activities. One particularly meaningful moment came in November, during our unit on community helpers, the same topic that had been so devastating with Mrs. Hartwell the previous year. This time, when Mrs. Peterson asked us to write about our future aspirations, I felt strong enough to resurrect my original dream. I wrote a detailed essay about wanting to become a teacher, explaining how I hope to help children discover their own potential and never make any child feel small or incapable. When Mrs. Peterson read my essay, she asked me to stay after class. My heart raced as I approached her desk, old anxieties temporarily overwhelming my newfound confidence. But Mrs. Peterson's expression was nothing but encouraging. "Sophia," she said, her voice warm with conviction, "this is a beautiful essay, and I want you to know that I think you would make an extraordinary teacher. You have exactly the kind of mind and heart that children need. Someone who understands both the joy of learning and the importance of kindness." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I know that someone once told you that teaching wasn't realistic for someone from your background. I want you to understand that person was completely wrong. Your background, your understanding of hard work, your appreciation for education, your empathy for others, these things don't disqualify you from teaching, they make you perfect for it." Those words began to heal wounds I hadn't even realized were still bleeding. For the first time since my encounter with Mrs. Hartwell, I allowed myself to truly believe that my dreams were not just possible but worthy. Mrs. Peterson went beyond mere encouragement. She began providing me with additional opportunities that would nurture my teaching aspirations. She allowed me to help younger students with their reading during library time, let me assist with bulletin board displays, and even asked for my input on lesson planning. "Teaching," she explained as we worked together one afternoon creating a display about different types of rocks, "isn't just about knowing your subject matter. It's about understanding how to make learning exciting, how to reach different types of learners, and how to create an environment where every child feels valued." As I watched her interact with our class, praising effort as much as achievement, finding each child's strengths, creating moments of discovery and wonder, I began to understand what real teaching looked like. It was the opposite of everything I had experienced with Mrs. Hartwell. By spring, my confidence had grown to the point where I was eager to take on new challenges. When Mrs. Peterson announced that our class would be participating in the district's Young Writers competition, I knew immediately that I wanted to enter. The competition required a short story of no more than 500 words on the theme of overcoming obstacles. As I sat at my kitchen table that evening, staring at the blank paper, I knew exactly what story I needed to tell. I wrote about a young bird who was told by a cruel crow that she would never be able to fly because her wings were too small and her voice too quiet. The bird believed the crow and stopped trying to fly, spending months walking on the ground and feeling ashamed of her limitations. But one day, a wise owl saw the bird struggling and asked her to try flying, just once, to see what might happen. When the bird finally spread her wings and leaped from a branch, she discovered that she could not only fly, but soar higher and more gracefully than any bird in the forest. The only thing that had kept her grounded, I wrote in my conclusion, was believing someone else's lie about who she was meant to be. When I submitted my story, Mrs. Peterson read it with tears in her eyes. "Sophia," she said softly, "this is more than just a story, isn't it?" I nodded, unable to speak around the emotion in my throat. "I'm so proud of you," she continued, "not just for your writing, which is exceptional, but for your courage in turning your pain into something beautiful that might help others." 3 weeks later, I learned that my story had won first place in the district competition for second-grade students. The prize was a savings bond for $25 and the opportunity to read my story aloud at the district's annual academic awards ceremony. Standing on that stage in front of hundreds of people, parents, teachers, school board members, and fellow students, reading words that had emerged from my deepest pain and transformation, I felt something I had never experienced before. The profound satisfaction of not just surviving something terrible, but using that experience to create something meaningful. In the audience, I could see my parents beaming with pride, Mrs. Peterson dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and Miss Riley, who had come specially to hear me read. But most importantly, I could see other children listening intently to my words, and I hoped that somewhere among them might be a child who needed to hear that cruel voices don't define us, that our dreams are valid regardless of what others say, and that we are capable of much more than our worst moments might suggest. As I finished reading and the audience erupted in applause, I realized that Mrs. Hartwell's attempt to diminish me had ultimately failed in the most complete way possible. Not only had I refused to accept her limitations, but I was now using my voice to encourage others to reject such limitations as well. I was 8 years old, and I had learned one of life's most valuable lessons, that our greatest triumphs often grow from the soil of our deepest struggles, and that the people who try to make us smaller often end up making us stronger than we ever thought possible. Now, as I sit here at 79 years old in my cozy home in Cedar Falls, Iowa, looking back across the decades that followed that transformative second-grade year, I can see how that early experience of cruelty and recovery shaped not just my childhood, but my entire life's purpose. The little girl who won that writing competition in 1952 did indeed become a teacher, but my journey to that classroom took paths I could never have imagined when I first declared that dream to Mrs. Hartwell all those years ago. After second grade, my academic journey flourished under a series of encouraging teachers who recognized and nurtured my potential. I skipped third grade entirely, moving directly into fourth grade where I continued to excel. By the time I reached high school, I was taking advanced courses and had become something of a local success story, the girl who had overcome early struggles to achieve academic distinction. But it wasn't until I began my teacher preparation program at Iowa State University in 1962 that I truly understood how my childhood experience with Mrs. Hartwell would define my professional mission. During a course on educational psychology, our professor, Dr. James Patterson, asked us to write about a defining moment in our own educational experience. For the first time since elementary school, I wrote openly about Mrs. Hartwell and the systematic way she had tried to destroy my confidence and limit my aspirations. As I put those memories on paper, I realized that her cruelty had taught me something invaluable. I knew intimately how it felt to be the child whose potential was overlooked, whose dreams were dismissed, whose worth was questioned. Dr. Patterson was so moved by my essay that he asked permission to share it with the education department faculty. That paper became the foundation for my senior thesis on recognizing and nurturing potential in students from disadvantaged backgrounds, research that would later influence my teaching philosophy for the next 4 decades. When I finally stood in front of my own first-grade classroom in the fall of 1966, I carried with me not just my education and training, but the hard-won wisdom of a child who had survived educational abuse and emerged stronger. I had learned to recognize the signs of a child whose spirit was being crushed, to spot the difference between genuine struggle and artificial limitation, and most importantly, to see potential where others might see only problems. My classroom became a sanctuary for children who had been overlooked or underestimated. Over the years, I taught the children of migrant workers who were told they were too transient to succeed academically. I nurtured students with learning differences who had been labeled as slow or difficult. I encouraged children from poverty who had been told that college was not for people like them. Each of these children reminded me of my 7-year-old self, sitting in that back corner, slowly believing the lies about my limitations. And with each child I helped to flourish, I felt like I was healing not just their wounds, but my own. One student in particular stands out in my memory. Maria Gonzalez came to my classroom in 1974 as a shy second grader whose family had recently immigrated from Mexico. She spoke little English and had been placed in what was then called the slow learners group by her previous teacher, who believed that language barriers indicated intellectual deficits. But I saw something in Maria's eyes, the same hungry curiosity I had once possessed, the same careful observation of everything around her, the same quick understanding masked by hesitant communication. I recognized in her the child I had been, capable but misunderstood, intelligent but dismissed. I worked with Maria individually, creating bilingual learning materials and celebrating her progress in both languages. I communicated with her parents through a translator, helping them understand that their daughter's bilingualism was a gift, not a deficit. Most importantly, I made sure Maria knew that her cultural background and family experiences were valuable additions to our classroom, not obstacles to overcome. By the end of that year, Maria was reading at grade level in both English and Spanish. She went on to excel throughout elementary school, earned a scholarship to college, and eventually became a pediatric nurse. When she visited my classroom years later with her own children, she told me something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Sons," she said, "you were the first teacher who made me feel like being different was something special instead of something wrong." Those words could have described my own experience with Mrs. Peterson, and they reminded me why I had chosen teaching as my life's work. Every child deserves to have at least one adult who sees their potential, believes in their dreams, and refuses to accept artificial limitations placed on their future. Throughout my 35-year teaching career, I made it my mission to be that adult for as many children as possible. I developed programs for gifted students from low-income families, created mentorship opportunities for first-generation college aspirants, and advocated tirelessly for equitable educational resources regardless of a child's background. But perhaps my most important work was the least visible: the daily interactions with children who needed someone to believe in them. The quiet conversations with students who had been told they weren't smart enough. The extra time spent with children whose potential others had written off. The gentle but firm insistence that every child in my classroom was capable of greatness, regardless of what others might have said about them. In 1985, I was honored as Teacher of the Year for our district, and during my acceptance speech, I finally told the complete story of Mrs. Hartwell and how her cruelty had shaped my commitment to nurturing rather than crushing children's spirits. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of other educators came forward to share their own stories of childhood educational trauma, and many spoke of how those experiences had influenced their own teaching philosophy. That speech led to invitations to speak at education conferences across the Midwest, where I shared strategies for recognizing and supporting underestimated students. I published articles about creating inclusive classrooms and co-authored a book titled Seeing Beyond Labels: Nurturing Potential in Every Child. When I retired in 2001, my greatest satisfaction came not from the awards or recognition, but from the hundreds of former students who had gone on to achieve dreams that others had once told them were impossible. Teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, business owners, social workers, children who had once been dismissed or underestimated, had grown into adults who are making positive contributions to their communities. But this story isn't just about my personal journey from victim to advocate. It's about a truth that applies to every child, every person, every dreamer who has ever been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough to pursue their aspirations. The lesson I learned from Mrs. Hartwell's cruelty and Mrs. Peterson's kindness is this: other people's opinions of us, no matter how authoritatively they're presented, do not determine our destiny. We have the power to prove wrong those who would limit us, and more importantly, we have the responsibility to ensure that our own voices never become the ones that crush another person's dreams. I think about Mrs. Hartwell sometimes, and I wonder if she ever realized the impact of her actions. Did she understand that her attempts to keep me in my place actually taught me to fight for every child's right to dream big? Did she know that her cruelty planted the seeds of empathy that would define my life's work? In a strange way, I'm grateful for that painful experience because it gave me something no education course could have provided: the absolute certainty that every child deserves to be seen, valued, and encouraged to reach their full potential. To anyone listening to this story who has ever been told they weren't smart enough, who has had their dreams dismissed as unrealistic, who has been made to feel small by someone in authority, please remember this: you are the author of your own story. Other people's limitations are not your truth. Their lack of vision is not your reality. You have within you the power to prove them wrong, to exceed their expectations, and to become everything you dare to dream. More than that, you have the opportunity to ensure that your own voice becomes one that lifts others up, rather than tears them down. The 7-year-old girl who was once told she would never amount to anything became a teacher who spent her life helping children discover their own potential. The child who was isolated and diminished became an adult who created classrooms where every student belonged and thrived. Mrs. Hartwell was wrong about me, and anyone who has ever told you that you're not good enough is wrong about you too. Your dreams are valid, your potential is real, and your future is limitless. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Play.